Um, quite a few of you here today, I'm actually still on watch and wait. And when I was asked to say a few words, I did rather wonder, well, what have I got to say? Because my journey so far has been relatively unremarkable. But it did strike me that even on watch and wait, there are perhaps some experiences that we've all had or that we can all recognise. So I'll say a little bit about my journey so far. So it's really very much the sort of early steps of CLL. A little bit about me though. As Frank said, my name's John. I'm married to Liz. We live in the village of Rainford, which is only a few miles from here, with two grown-up sons, John and Andrew, who both live with their partners in Leeds. I was lucky enough to be able to retire 4 years ago at the age of 60. Both of us are pretty active. My wife's very keen on horse riding, so I've started doing a bit of horse riding. And we're keen walkers and gardeners, so we're pretty active. So really in terms of the first signs that something was up with my health was towards the end of 2013. I seem to be getting, and I'm sure a lot of you will recognise this, sort of frustratingly recurrent bouts of sort of flu-like symptoms, which were taking a while to shake off. And then in early 2014, we went on a family skiing holiday, and I spent the entire holiday in bed. So I knew at that point there was something seriously up to be sort of lying in bed while everybody else was out skiing. So I decided I'd better see the GP when I got home. So I went to the GP, described the symptoms, a blood test was organised. A week later, I was back to see the GP to get the results of the blood test. And I'm sure this is a familiar experience to you. As soon as I saw him, it was obvious that the news wasn't great. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. And with a tremor in his voice, he finally managed to say, "I'm really so sorry to tell you, but I'm afraid you have blood cancer. It's probably leukemia." So bang. Two pretty terrifying words was all I heard. Cancer and leukemia. And these were not things that I was familiar with. And I'm sure a lot of the rest of you would not have been. And after that, of course, you don't really register anything that the GP's saying. I think he thrust a pile of papers that he'd printed off instead of explaining, there's a pile of papers in my hand, and said something about arranging an appointment with a specialist. Oddly, and it was interesting, I was talking to, I think it was Stephen, the main sort of thought that came into my head, strangely, was feeling rather sorry for this very young GP who looked pretty terrified about having to tell me I had blood cancer. And so my thinking was, it must have been awful for him to have to say that. And he clearly seemed to have no idea about the possibility that this might be a condition that one can continue quite happily living with for many years into the future. I mean, he thought he was delivering a kind of death sentence, I was interested to hear what Linda was saying, because, and again, this will be familiar to all of you. So I've had this sort of diagnosis, but it's a pretty unspecific one. It's just cancer, leukemia, dreadful. So the following hours and days were kind of full of that emotional turmoil that I'm sure we all recognise. I had little or no idea of what the diagnosis meant, or even what the diagnosis actually was. So you're thinking, well, what's going to happen? And I mean, how long have I got to live? I mean, is it months? Weeks? The other thing that really overwhelmed me, again, thinking about Linda's slide about the sort of emotions you feel, I think for me, and I suspect some of you may recognise this, it wasn't so much about me. It was I had a sense of sort of overwhelming guilt that I had cancer and that I was kind of letting everybody down, because I shouldn't be like this. And I felt like it was somehow my fault that I was going to be, then I thought, deserting my wife and children and family and these sort of thoughts do go through your mind, don't they, when you have this diagnosis. And there were certainly quite a few tears shed in those early sort of few days while you're trying to get to grips with what's it all about. And of course, you've very little information. And then, of course, my wife Liz and I got completely sort of snared in the internet. And now I know that, again, the slides we've just seen were talking about go to the right sites. But which are the sites you go to and where do you go to? Because there was no information from the GP about so you start looking at Googling leukemia and, it's a frightening place to go if you don't know where to look or what you're looking for. And it was, confusing and contradictory and misleading. And of course, our inability to even understand and interpret this stuff made it all that much worse. And I'm sure at least some of you here have been through this experience. And really that was my first sort of occasion to come up against our support association, and we found the website, and that was a tremendous sort of kind of relief to find somewhere where there was some sensible advice about this stuff, and you could begin to make some sort of sense of it, and helped us both recognise that maybe this leukemia thing wasn't quite the sort of imminent death sentence that, because you imagine all sorts of stuff, don't you, when you first get diagnosed. And anyway, so meeting the consultant. I think actually we did pretty well because it was only 2 weeks after the initial blood test results and the sort of initial diagnosis. Now, I know talking to 1 or 2 people around here that for some of you it was 6 weeks or more before you saw a specialist. So 2 weeks was pretty good, but nevertheless, that 2 weeks seemed interminable, really, because 2 weeks of not knowing basically whether you're going to live or die, it's pretty harrowing, isn't it? So I had this first appointment with the haematology consultant, and this I think is something probably you recognise as well. Because one of the first things he said was, if you're going to have cancer, this is one of the best ones to have. Oh, lucky me was not exactly what I was thinking at the time. He seemed very pleased with it. I do kind of now understand what he meant. The big thing for me was learning that this wasn't about to kill me anytime soon. That treatment possibly might not even be necessary, because there are people here that have been on watch and wait for a decade or more, I think. Certainly the person Paul, I think, is gone now. He'd been on watch and wait for 10 years and no need for treatment. And also, if treatment became necessary, there was very effective treatment available. And so immediately kind of huge weights lifted off you, isn't it? This sense of, well, blimey, this isn't half as bad as I thought it was in the first place. So pretty early on after that, one of the things that seemed pretty clear to me, and I know people have different views about this, but for me it seemed important to tell, my closest friends and family that I'd got CLL, but at the same time to reassure them that it wasn't half as scary as it sounds, and that they were likely to have to put up with me for a good many years more, And now this is quite kind of personal feeling about this, but the more I thought about it, the more I felt that that CLL wasn't that big a deal in any case, whatever happened really. To my way of thinking, and this is, just my own personal way of dealing with this, it was hardly an excuse for any kind of self-pity, because, crikey, I'm 60 odd. I've had a pretty good life. Chances are I've got, a fair bit more to go. Actually, I've been pretty lucky, really. So, this is no tragedy either way. Especially when I think about one of my dearest and oldest friends who's completely immobilised by Parkinson's disease, and that's a real horror, something actually, this isn't actually a bad deal at all. And since that diagnosis in 2014, I've been fortunate enough to be able to continue to do the things that I enjoy doing, and being as active as ever. For me, and I know this is different for different people, but I'm really not conscious of thinking about CLL on a sort of day-to-day basis. I'm lucky, I think, in that sense. For some, I know it's something that is there all the time. It's not something that I dwell on, fortunately. Which is interesting, really, because normally I'm a bit of a mither and a worrier, but for some reason I don't dwell on it. And I also think, and this is going to sound really corny, I think actually it does make you sort of reassess things a bit. This I know it sounds awfully trite, but it's true for me. I think being diagnosed with CLL has actually made me a little bit more aware of the things that make me happy in life, family and friends, and a little more appreciative of the sort of joys of living. I know it sounds corny, but actually, for me, that's actually, in a funny sort of way, one of the bonuses of CLL. Anyway, of course, I do always think about CLL when the flipping blood check thing's about to come round. It's always a bit nerve-wracking, isn't it, a day or two before that? Because, you managed to put it behind you for, a few months, and then there's this flipping blood check test thing. And waiting to discover what's happened to these numbers, So I was on 6 months, and the numbers have been sort of creeping the wrong way a bit, so I'm now on 3 monthly checks. Now, and again, this is interesting what Linda was saying about the patient being sort of almost you as a person being pushed to one side. I think that is a bit of you do feel a bit like that sometimes. I do anyway. So it sometimes feels that you're a bit of a sort of hostage to the disease in some way. Your consultant's there looking at these numbers, trying to read the runes of the numbers. And maybe, and I'm not, this isn't a sort of attack on the guy that I'm sort of being treated by, or, under, as it were. But sometimes the sense that there's so much focus on the numbers that they're not seeing you as a person. And it's difficult then not to feel like a bit of a bystander in all this, rather than where you should be as a whole person, sort of centre stage. And again, this comes back, I think, to what Linda and Jane were really saying, that, that is a big danger. And what I've realised, and I'm sure all of us here have realised, that you do need to mug up on what some of these numbers mean, and when it comes to treatment, what the options are, so that you can actually have a sensible conversation with your specialist, with the consultant, and ask some informed questions, so that you do have a more sense of a control over wherever this journey is going. And this is very much like, I think what Moira was saying, was actually getting some control. So, it is that sense of arming yourself with enough knowledge, and I haven't gone in great detail, but enough knowledge to ask some sensible questions, so you feel part of the process, not this kind of bystander or hostage to the sort of numbers, basically. So I suppose that's, for me now, even more important now that the numbers are sort of going in the wrong direction. When it comes to sort of living well with CLL, for me personally, I don't do a lot of stuff, but I suppose kind of eating reasonably sensibly, getting plenty of exercise, putting my feet up when I feel totally whacked. Actually, it's a great excuse whenever the cricket or the rugby, suddenly I'm completely whacked. I've got to spend the day in front of the telly. I do tend to slightly obsessively carry one of these antibacterial hand gels around with me. And I do take these multivitamins. Although zinc didn't come up because I thought that was one of the things that was supposed to be quite good. And I am wary of people with coughs and sneezes and so on. I do still travel on crowded trains and planes, but feel a bit uneasy about doing so, I must admit. I started drinking green tea, didn't particularly like it. Then I discovered, I think wasn't the last of the World Conference before, somebody said you'd have to drink the equivalent of an Olympic-sized swimming pool for it to make any difference. So I'm very given up on that, although I understand you can get some kind of concentrated capsules that, some people say are great. So as for the future, well, who knows? I will, I hope, continue to be as active as I can, and amongst other things, continue to make a contribution to this association alongside other colleagues as a trustee. I know I will probably need treatment, but I do feel incredibly reassured, both from listening to people at these conferences and speaking to yourselves and colleagues, that effective, successful treatment options are available, and the outlook for the future, for me, and I think for all of us really, is very positive. So thank you very much.